Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for coming. I know it's been a break of almost a month, but we were, caught up in, as we all know, difficult times. But warm welcome to Tiyali, who is our newest person at within our cluster, I think. So of the architecture school, the planning school, and the design school, and I'm really happy to see so many people from the design school as well here today. Um, so without much ado, I'm going to just give a slightly longer introduction to Tiyali. Tiyali is an urban transport planner. She has a master's from CEPT University, Ahmedabad in urban transport planning and management. And she got her doctorate from IIT Kharagpur, also in urban transport planning. And her doctoral thesis was part of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, Government of India funded transportation project that focused on developing the level of service scales, prioritization techniques for bus and para transit services based on user perception. And she has been involved in developing software that has generated optimized bus and paratransit schedules for an entire service period based on the cost of operation, users' willingness to pay, and user based level of service values for quantitative service quality attributes. She's also worked extensively in developing GIS based master plans, local area plans for transit oriented development, so TODs, solid waste management, and city street vending plans. And she joined us earlier this year, and her research interests lie in designing transportation systems based on the user perspective and the policy implications of ODTT systems. So, her title for today's proposition is User Perception and Bus Attribute Characteristics, Revisiting Kano Model Using USL Curves. Um, Welcome, Tiyali, and yeah, please take over.
Thank you. Okay, I'll share my screen and also, switch off my video because that
Yes,
kind of
sure.
helps in
Yes.
better presentation. Yeah. Good. Is my screen visible?
It, yeah, it is now. All right. You could make it full screen if you like. Yeah. All right. Great.
Yeah. Is it fine? Yeah. Okay. Uh, Good morning, everyone. I'm Tiyali Bose, faculty at the School of Planning and Development, Sushant University. The research that I'll be presenting right now is titled User Perception and Bus Attribute Characteristics, Revisiting the Kano Model. This work is part of my doctoral thesis submitted at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. The presentation is structured as, research background. Then I'll talk about the overall aims and objectives of the thesis. Then a discussion on how service performance is evaluated in transportation studies. And then I'll discuss the concept of Kano model, and from then onwards, the methodology of understanding attribute characteristics, and thus defining the nature of relationship between service performance and user satisfaction. I will then briefly discuss my case study areas, the survey design, result of my analysis, and finally the conclusion and way forward. So, there's a huge body of literature that observes improving bus transit service quality. Bus transit service quality based on customers' expectations is a key element in retaining existing customers and attracting future users. This has led to increased focus on users' perception in assessment of service quality and undertaking priority decisions based on customer feedback. Studies on bus transit service attribute characteristics also highlight an asymmetric relationship between user satisfaction and service level. While certain attributes, have higher dissatisfaction at lower levels of service, but a higher level of service may have no impact on users' satisfaction. So most studies on public transit systems also fail to provide any insight on the gain in ridership or user satisfaction that results from improvement in service level. In case of developing countries like India, bus transport operators also need to provide quality service at a price that is affordable across all socioeconomic strata of the society. This complexity necessitates the development of a comprehensive framework which would enable transit service operators to decide on what service to provide, how much to provide, when to provide, while considering the user's willingness to pay for improved services for better allocation of resources. With this brief premise in mind, the overall aim of my thesis, PhD thesis, was to develop a methodology that would enable transit service operators to improve bus transit service quality, considering the degree of criticality of an attribute, the performance of an attribute, the asymmetric relationship between service level and user satisfaction and users' willingness to pay. And thus there were two objectives of the research, namely identification of quantitative and qualitative service quality attributes based on user perception, and development of a comprehensive framework for prioritizing bus service quality attributes, considering the asymmetric relationship between service level and user satisfaction. What I'm presenting today is basically a sub-objective of a sub-objective, which is to determine the nature of relationship between attribute performance and user satisfaction. So now, before I move on to the service performance and onwards, there is something I would like to highlight. There is a theory of reasoned action, and later there was a theory of perceived behavior, which stated that users' behavior can be determined by their choices or their intent to act. And the user's perceived importance and their perceived evaluation of the existing performance of the service affect their motivation to use the service. So belief and behavior influences priorities, and eventually decisions are taken based on their perceived evaluation of the service. So higher perceived satisfaction may lead to higher ridership. So now if you look into the research on transit service prioritization, specifically based on user perception, you will find that priority is primarily evaluated from two perspectives: the importance of a service attribute to the users and performance of a service attribute based on user perception. Though my thesis addressed both the approaches, here I will be focusing only on service performance. The most common measures are gap analysis and measurement of level of service scales, and determination of user zone of tolerance. Now, gap analysis is one of the first methodologies used for performance measurement, where the differences between the user's expectations and perceptions are analyzed to identify the current necessity. And the most common measurement tool is actually ServQual. Now, the user zone of tolerance is another method for determining service performance, where the existing perceived level of service is evaluated based on the user's minimum acceptable level of service and the desired level of service. And then you have the level of service scales based on user perception, which enable transit operators to assess the existing service delivery level and the appropriate range for future service delivery. Now, LOS can be also be used as a form of derived zone of tolerance. And there's a study by Das and Pandit on bus transit service quality attributes, where they have used law of successive interval scaling for developing LOS scales based on user perception. And the advantage of this method was it eliminated the arrows paradox and can be applied on data that has been obtained through random onboard services conducted at different points of time. So what happens is, irrespective of all the gap analysis, the zone of tolerance, the level of service scales, all these service performance measures, the main issue still rises that assessment of these transit services using either importance or performance approach are effective in highlighting users' perceptions and their expectations. but the resultant increase or decrease in transit ridership or satisfaction that occurs with, with change in service delivery level is not taken into consideration. And that is where the concept of user satisfaction level curves comes into the picture. It is an effective way to determine attribute performance and the corresponding level of user satisfaction. The USL is basically defined as a cumulative percentage share of satisfied users at various service delivery levels for a particular service attribute. It is basically a trend line that expresses the relationship between user satisfaction and the service level. However, it does not define the nature of relationship between user satisfaction and service level. And this is where the proponents of Kano model and the three-factor theory comes into play. They basically state that the relation between improved services and increase in level of satisfaction is asymmetric, and that there are certain services, when not provided, leads to increase in dissatisfaction. But if you provided a very high level of service, people are simply indifferent, so they don't even care. And then there are services where, even at low levels of services, yeah, people are fine, but slight improvement gives to very high level of satisfaction. And so they basically characterized service attributes into basic factors, excitement factors, and performance factor. Kano actually proposed a fourth attribute, also the indifference attribute. But in case of this study, we'll actually consider the three-factor theory and only consider basic excitement and performance. Now, to give a simpler example of the Kano model, if I take, we all are used to mobile phones and everything. So, nowadays we are so used to high-speed internet services that, if the speed increases from 100 Mbps to 200 Mbps, you wouldn't even know, or even you care that, there has been an improvement in the service because we're so used to high-speed internet. But if there is a lag of, say, even 20 seconds in loading your web page, it leaves us annoyed. And so, we may classify, this kind of a characteristic, that, providing a high level of service, does not lead to any increase in your satisfaction level, but a slight drop in the service leads to high dissatisfaction. And that is what a basic attribute is. Then you have your excitement attribute, and the best example that I could think of is basically foldable LCD screens. I believe all of you have a smartphone, and we are happy and most of us are happy and contented with it. But if you're to receive a high-end Samsung phone with foldable LCD screens, I'm sure you will be delighted. And that is kind of what explains the characteristics of excitement attributes. Users are satisfied and indifferent basically at their existing levels of service, which may often be low levels of service. However, a simple improvement, here it's a technological invention, but an improvement in the LCD screen type leads to a huge increase in satisfaction level. And finally, you have the performance attribute. So, your performance attribute is, it has a more linear nature. So, the best example I could think of is that of camera phones in our mobiles. So, the higher the resolution, the higher the pixel quality, you're happy with it, and that is what basically performance attributes are. So now getting back to the evaluation of the three-factor theory, Matzler and others in 2004 identified attribute characteristics with the help of regression analysis using dummy variables. So two sets of regression were conducted to identify the impact of factor performance on overall satisfaction. So when the performance is low and then when it is high. And finally, based on regression coefficients, attributes were classified into basic, excitement, and performance factor. Cherencherry and Moitro, also in this study on bus service attributes in Kolkata, adopted the three-factor theory, but they use an integrated approach using fuzzy Siemens clustering. But a major disadvantage of both these methods are that they fail to provide a clear understanding on the threshold levels of service attribute to performance or service levels based on which attribute characteristics can be defined. So, they talks about, what kind of an attribute it is, but it does not give you an insight on what is the service performance at that level. And so now, getting back again to the user satisfaction level curve, which I mentioned earlier, which is basically a 4-parameter logistic curve or a 4PL curve, which can be used not only to define service performance, but also the nature of relationship between performance and satisfaction. The concept of 4PL curves was used, in dose response theory, or so rather dose response studies. Those were in the field of bioassay development, and what the study does is, it identifies bend points, which are obtained using a mixed partial derivative that identifies the points on the 4PL curve where the rate of change, these are basically the bend points. So, and at these bend points, the rate of change in response is basically 0. So, if I try to define the characteristics of the 4PL user satisfaction level curve, so it is basically a curve which is defined by a linear portion with it's a linear portion with 2 defined points on either end, where the curve where the curve flattens or reaches a plateau. The area under the curve basically signifies the percentage of users satisfied, and the location of the bend points helps in determining the threshold points where there is abrupt change in user satisfaction. Also, for an ideal, in case of a perfect response or an ideal service, the range between the two endpoints consists around 64% of the total range. The midpoint of the two horizontal points, which is basically this point, okay, it is of the two horizontal asymptotes. So these are your asymptotes, and this is your midpoint. This midpoint is called as EC50, and the same can be adopted for understanding the nature of relationship between service level and user satisfaction in case of public transit service, with the bend points being the threshold points for change in user satisfaction. So basically, the determination of nature of relationship between service performance and user satisfaction involves a twofold approach, where the performance is evaluated based on LOS scales, based on user perception using a law of interval scaling. I think the next slide will be a better explanation. So, based on users' perceived level of existing service delivery level and the level of satisfaction for the same, the LOS scales, the level of service scales, are developed using law of successive interval scaling. This LOS scales based on users' perception act as a derived form of user zone of tolerance range for various service attributes. The lower boundary of LOSA is defined as the desired level of service, and the lower boundary of LOSC is defined as the minimum acceptable level of service. Then you have the USL curves, which are developed for satisfied users, and here we define satisfied users are on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is absolutely dissatisfied and 5 is very good or a very good service. So users who have responded as 3, 4, 5, so average, good, and very good, were considered as satisfied users. So next, the bend points on the curves are identified using a mixed partial derivative of response variable, and the bend points on the curve help in identifying the rate of change in cumulative percentage of shared users. And based on location on the bend points on the user curves and the user's derived zone of tolerance, attribute characteristics are classified as basic, excitement, and performance. So, basic attributes are characterized characterized by a longer plateau, and the range between the bend points is less than 64%. of the zone of tolerance, these do not lead to significant increase in satisfaction with initial improvement in levels of service. However, beyond a threshold point, what you'll find is there's a sharp rise in the user's perceived level of satisfaction. Then you have the excitement attributes. Also, in excitement attributes, you will find like similar basic attributes. There's a longer plateau. But if you notice that in case of basic attributes, the long, you know, the upper plateau, the upper range is longer, while in case of excitement attributes, the lower plateau is actually longer. And then you have the performance attributes, where the ranges between the sigmoid points cover almost 64% or more of the total service. So that is the performance attributes. Now moving into the case study areas. So the study was basically conducted in 3 class 1 towns of India, namely Kolkata, Visakhapatnam and Rajkot. They were selected for the purpose of the study, but these 3 cities are basically of different size, location, transport characteristics, geographical location, and they also had BRT services at various stages of development at the time of the survey, which was mainly conducted during the period of August 2016 to October 2018. So, coming to Kolkata, the West Bengal Transport Corporation operates public bus services in Kolkata, which majorly consists of air-conditioned. I'm talking about the time of the survey when it was conducted, which mainly consisted of air-conditioned services and non-air-conditioned bus services. The study focuses on bus routes that operate only along the Eastern Metropolitan Bypass corridor, and which is basically an 18-kilometer corridor and is served by 55 WPTC bus routes. Surveys were, however, conducted on board 13 WPTC buses, of which 7 were AC bus routes and 6 were non-AC bus routes. These routes were selected on the criteria that a minimum of 50% of the entire route length of the selected bus routes are part of the EM bypass corridor. Then you have your Visakhapatnam. So the second case study was for Visakhapatnam, which was and over here you have the Andhra Pradesh State Road Transport Corporation, or the APSRTC, which runs non-air conditioned city bus services in the city. It is also the major mode of transportation for the economically weaker sections of the society, and the study was conducted along 2 proposed BRT corridors in the city, namely the Pendurthi Transit Corridor, which was a 20.4 kilometer stretch, and you had the Simhachalam Transit Corridor, which was a 22.6 kilometer stretch. Similar to Kolkata and Visakhapatnam, also the bus routes with 50% of the total operational route lying within the selected corridor was selected for study. And so we had 54 APSRTC bus routes which ply along the corridor, of which 30 routes were selected for the study. And then the third case study is Rajkot, where it was served by both BRT services and municipal bus transport services. So the BRT services is of approximately 10.7 kilometer, known as the Rajkot Rajpath Limited, which operated with 18 bus stops connecting Gondal Chowk to Madhpur Chowk. The municipal bus service, known as the Rajkot Municipal Transport Services, or RMTS, operates along 32 routes with 231 bus stops over a network length of 178 kilometers. There is no overlapping of BRT and RMTS bus routes. However, the services intersect each other at various important locations in the city. In Rajkot, surveys have been conducted on BRT buses flying on the operational corridor. Of the 57 routes of the RMTS service that serve the entire city, 33 routes have been selected for the study purpose. These service bus routes, the RMTS bus routes, basically act as a feeder to the BRT services. I'm not getting into the details of survey design and the questionnaire. So, just to tell you that, a total of 1,500 samples were collected from each of the 3 cities. And the final usable sample was around 1,244 for Kolkata, 1,085 for Visakhapatnam, and 1,019 for Rajkot. So this is basically the user perception based level of service scales developed for quantitative service attributes. because that was the most measurable, you will find that the LOS scale ranges actually varies from city to city. It varies for it's not the same for Kolkata, Visakhapatnam, and Rajkot. And this basically again highlights that the user perception, your socioeconomic characteristics, your type of service that you use, your experience impacts how you perceive the service. So in Kolkata, where you had multiple options, you had government buses, you had private buses, you have metro services, you have tram services. So people had more options. While in Visakhapatnam, you just had APSRTC services where, during peak hours, you have, you know, the most buses, while in during off peak hours, sometimes people had to wait for almost half an hour to 45 minutes for one bus. And then you had Rajkot where, you have both services. Um, People have experience of a good service in the form of BRT service, and so they are kind of able to understand or explain what a good service is. So if you look at say the service waiting time, you'll find that there are slight differences, or if you look at the on-time performance of the service, so you will find that there are differences across the three cities. This is basically a tabular form to explain the USL curves. What I'll do is, so if I move into the attribute characteristics, so basically all all graphs highlighted in red are, all service attributes highlighted in red are performance attributes. All those in green are basic attributes, and all those in blue are basically excitement attributes. And so, just to highlight it, so this is example of basic services of service hours in Kolkata. So what you see is that your observed, I'm not going to, so if you look at the USL curve, so this is the USL curve, this is your USL curve, this is your observed data points, and what we have is these are the LOS service level scales. So over here, anything above 18 hours was considered as LOS A, and so 16 to around 18 was LOS B. Then around 13 hours to 16 hours was LOS C. 10 to 12 was LOS D, and anything less than 10 hours was considered as LOS E level of service. And this was users perceived. This was what the users perceived was the existing service hours of the city, which was around 17 hours. And if you look at the USL curve, which is this line, so you will find that the user's zone of tolerance, even though the user's zone of tolerance is between 20 hours and over here somewhere around 15 hours, the existing service hours is around 17 hours for service. And user have reached, so this was basically the service where you would see a high increase in user satisfaction, but the current service is actually above the plateau level. And so it is above the higher sigmoid point, and there is a plateau which has been reached. So this is for the various attributes, and this is for Visakhapatnam, Rajkot. So just to overall summarize the attribute characteristics, there was a distinct similarity, if you will observe, between user satisfaction and service level of bus for Visakhapatnam and Rajkot. Unlike in Kolkata, where most of the attributes are basic, in Visakhapatnam and Rajkot you will find they're characterized mainly as excitement, and that is because the bus services were comparatively new, and the users are used to low levels of service. So a slight improvement in the service, introduction of the BRT in Rajkot suddenly led to an increase in their level of satisfaction. So most of the attributes are classified were as excitement. So just to kind of summarize the entire thing. So, the study basically validated the observations of previous research, that there is that there exists an asymmetric relation. So, it's not a linear relationship that you improve service and there will be increase in ridership. So after a certain point, irrespective of whether you improve the service or it doesn't make a difference to the user. And this asymmetric relationship, varied based on socioeconomic characteristics and specifically user experience. So the user, if they're used to a better improvement, a better service with, or they're used to transport service with alternatives which give, which are at high level of service, their perception of the service varies. And simply the way forward was, most of the study was basically for quantitative attributes, and the qualitative attributes were not taken into consideration because at that point of time we had time constraint, and we couldn't figure out how to bring this into the qualitative, because end of the day, the qualitative experience also matters. So this study was specifically for quantitative service attributes, and qualitative is something which we can further explore. These were some of the references. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiyali.
I'm sorry. I think it was, I tried to brain everything as fast as I could.
No, I think we have time. I'm actually quite intrigued to hear from your data that you improve things and things are not really, people are not going to actually think of that if that's the net sum. But I'll open it up first to the audience. And if there's someone who'd like to come in with questions for Tiyali or observations.
I had a question.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, Sachin.
Actually, I would be interested in seeing the survey, because how the survey is capturing the experience of the people, that is a kind of
Yes. So basically,
because numbers. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So basically, what was done? So the survey was, so initially we conducted a pilot survey. Okay. So, and we did a pilot survey to. The first pilot survey was more like a Reiki survey, and it kind of helped us to fine tune a questionnaire. And then we did a user perception survey. So we did a user perception on board buses, and what we did was, it was so for EM bypass corridor, we had identified from where the buses started, and what was the origin, the terminal points in the bus services, and the when the surveys were being conducted, so we would do it on board buses, because in that way, because it was just not about getting user perception for satisfaction. It included other parameters also, and basically the actual survey was done in a threefold basis. So after the pilot survey, we did the bus user perception survey on board buses, where we would board the bus at the terminals, and we would try to and the service was actually conducted for an entire period, for from say around 8 in the morning to 8 in the evening, and there was a survey team, of course, and uh, passengers were randomly selected. But the only thing that we did was, we always found it, so it was a process. So you would board the bus, and so we aimed for the terminals, because at that point, you would find a seat. So we kind of developed a process. So we would have, say, every bus, we would have, say, three surveyors, one at the entrance, one somewhere located in between, and one at the end. And all these passengers, so the surveyors would sit, so they would, because they were at the terminals, so they would get a seat. And so the first person who sits beside them, they would survey them. And uh, then, and slowly, because almost one questionnaire would take around 15 minutes. So they would survey them, and by that time you would have a few more passengers, and because there are three persons already in the bus, so it would kind of create a buzz, and people, users are intrigued. intrigued by everything. So, because there are 3 surveys or anything, so you would have people peep in, peep out. And then, so after surveying the person sitting beside you, you would get up, offer the person standing beside you, give them the seat, and request them to fill up the surveys. And, and this was the way we kind of conducted the survey. So it was basically a random survey. So we did not specifically select, so whoever was ready to answer. But yes, they were specifically for bus users, and they were onboard service. We also conducted a bit of household survey also. Uh, and that was for, so, we selected a buffer of around 1 kilometer, actually, a buffer of 1 kilometer along all the corridors. And so we identified major residential areas along these corridors. So for EM bypass corridor, your Pendurthi corridor, your Simachalam corridor, and also for your PRTS corridor in Rajkot. We identified a buffer area of 1 kilometer, and the major residential areas were identified. Yes, in household survey, the challenge was that we couldn't cover uh, high income group. So if you look at, if I share with you, just a minute, if I share with you the screen, you will, the sample composition, that just, you will find that the high income group is not that well represented. It is basically, most of it is basically the lower income group and the middle income group. And if you look, and so we try to define the characteristics based on sex, age, the income category, the vehicle ownership. Because the surveys were conducted throughout the day, so we had both P car and off P car, and the bus type, and also how frequently they use. So basically, we captured most of the irregular users from the household survey. We got some from on bus user survey also, and because we conducted the survey during off-peak hours also, so we could actually capture a few of irregular users. And then based on trip purpose, so whether they were doing a compulsory trip like work or education, or whether they were using bus services for non-compulsory trips like recreation or marketing, shopping, or just health, or just accompanying someone somewhere. So yes, does that answer your question?
Well, I was actually wanting to see the relation between questions and the attributes.
Question.
But it's
I
okay. That will be a little longer
y-
discussion.
yeah, that'll be a longer discussion.
Extensive. Uh,
What I can just basically
of-
tell you, so if you look at the survey question, I have a small thing on survey questionnaire. So the questionnaire consisted information on their location, demographic characteristics, travel characteristics, trip characteristics, uh, and the importance of various service quality attributes, their existing perceived level of service. So it was what they perceived as the existing service level. So even though, say, the bus arrives, say, every 5 minutes, but the user thinks it arrives at every 10 minutes, we consider that. And then their level of satisfaction. Yes. Anything else?
yeah, maybe you can share it with Sachin.
Yeah. Yes.
Fine. Yeah. Tiyali, sorry, may I ask you to please turn on your video now?
Yeah. Sure.
Thanks. All right. Uh, any other thanks, Tiyali? Any other questions? Himanshu, I think you were asking.
Sorry to interrupt you, ma'am. I just have a quick question.
Yes,
This is
please, Purva.
Purva.
Hi.
Apart from user satisfaction, are there any other performance indicators that you looked upon during your research?
Yes. So basically, so that's what I was saying. So I looked into importance. Uh, importance. I looked into performance, and I also looked into users' willingness to pay for a service. So the importance was looked into from the stated importance perspective, where I undertook a Reddit analysis. Then I used derived importance, which is based on. So I can say that this is if I anyone you ask, they have a tendency to over-exaggerate or overemphasize importance of something and underestimate or, state that the service is underperforming. So when you look at satisfaction, people tend to always, hold back. While if you talk about importance, they'll be like, yes, it is very important. And so the study looked into importance approach from both from a stated importance approach, where I used read-it analysis to analyze that, and then there was a derived importance where I used ordinal logistic regression along with partial log likelihood. So we kind of used both of it to develop importance performance analysis, and that was the importance perspective. And from there, we identified attributes which were of higher, which were both important as well as people were considered as satisfied, or so it was of higher performance. Then we did a performance analysis. Part of the performance analysis, one was to define the LOS scale from a user perception. Then we did this USL curve to identify at what level of service, how much percentage of people are satisfied, and what is the nature of relationship. And combining this two, we defined a performance, we defined a performance scale. And, but, so yes, you have importance, you have performance, but end of the day, whatever you state, money matters. So even if it is a good service or everything that is people are satisfied, if people are not ready to pay for the service, it doesn't make sense. And so we also had a user's willingness to pay concept, which I did not present over here. So we used actually discrete choice modeling to do a user's willingness to pay, and that is where we finalized which attributes. So we initially had, say, around 58 attributes. For quantitative, it was brought down to, say, around 2 attributes. And finally, we found there were actually 3 or 4 attributes which needs to be prioritized for each of the 3 cities. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, ma'am. Thanks. Very interesting body of work, seriously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Purva, you're also a planner, I believe, or you've engineer, but you've done.
Actually, I am a civil engineer by background. So I have a master's in structures and I have a PhD in construction. So I had dealt with a little bit of planning things. My work was mostly in planning, and it's basically about design planning and design management. So
Right.
I dealt with all these things in terms of survey-based things and tool-based things during my research also.
Okay.
So anyway, thank you.
Manchut, would you like to ask a question?
Hello.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Tiyali. So, in your attributes, you focused on many points, and which were very relevant for quantitative study. But somewhere did you come across this idea of frequency, where on a particular route, I mean, a city would have 40, 50 routes.
Yes,
And
I did I did not consider, I mean, it was not frequency as in service headway. Yes, I did it.
Because service headway, yes, I mean that would give out the headway time between the two buses or 2 vehicles. But frequency in the sense where a dedicated frequency set for each and every city, because in comparison with what a city without BRT route would have and a city with BRT route would have. So the service over there or the LOS over there would be really faster when it has BRT. So did in your study did you come across the bus bunching idea?
Yes,
And how did you tackle that? How did you tackle that?
So the thing is, bus bunching. So this work was, again, my PhD was part of it's basically part of 3 sets of work. So we came across bus bunching, but it was not tackled by my thesis. So there was another thesis along with my work in the project, which actually looked into the operator's perspective, and that is where we tackled bus bunching. So we used service optimization, and we took the so what this entire project did was we used so the user perception was used to identify attributes which were important to the user. And when you look at an operator perspective, they actually look into the quantitative numbers. And so the quantitative attributes, so as a result, the detailing out of quantitative attributes were taken up. And the attributes which were of higher priority were taken up in the operator perspective. And that is where we actually tackled bus punching, but that was not part of my research.
Okay, because I feel as a user of public transport, and the kind of DTC service I'm taking example of Delhi, and if I have to compare that with Bombay from where I am, so the routes and the frequency in both these cities, they differ a lot. Early morning the frequency is in 5 minutes or maybe 10 minutes, but
Yes.
as you progress towards afternoon and evening, the frequency comes down, and people have to wait for good 30 minutes, as you pointed out.
Yes. So
So
that was
one of
something which we considered. So as you said, you talk in terms of minutes. You talk about so we considered it as both as a service healthy as well as a waiting time. So as a user, you don't think about whether, and we also looked into reliability. So as a user, you basically, when you reach a bus stop, you think about how much time I'm waiting at the bus service for the bus, right? So even though you talk, as you say that there are buses available every 5-10 minutes for you, I mean, this was actually what we observed. We had initially kept it as a frequency, but when we did a pilot survey, one of the major things that came out was waiting time at the bus was more important to them. So that is waiting time and service healthy. So we captured frequency through waiting time at the bus stop. So how much time people are waiting at the bus stop, and what is their perception of the time that they have to wait between two consecutive bus services.
correct. So maybe you know I feel that could become one of the key attributes for anyone to use public transport. But as you mentioned in your way forward, this could be taken up in the qualitative survey that needs to taken up further. So maybe in that segment we can discuss and take it further. Thanks, Tiyali. But otherwise, the comparison of all the uh, aspects that you have covered and the models that you have used is really helping. I mean, for others it might seem more technical and more dots and other blips, but then these models really help in understanding whether the service is really going up or it's really going down. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Lena, you have your hand raised. Would you like to come in and say something?
Yes, thank you so much, Radha. So, a fascinating survey, obviously, Tiyali. I had a question. So, what usually happens is these kind of research projects, which are based on user perception, usually that gives rise to a certain amount of interpretation by the person who is conducting the survey, because you'll be talking to people. What was the role of culture and language in interpreting what data you got from your users? Because you're inputting the data all in terms of numbers, and
So
you're getting it all as perceptions.
yeah, so basically, just to to avoid say to avoid this culture and linguistic issue, so the surveys were basically done by local people. So we actually had an intensive training of the surveyors. So the survey in Kolkata was done by, from you know people Bengali speaking, people living in Kolkata. Same for Visakhapatnam.
Yes.
And so it was, so our surveys for Visakhapatnam was not exactly all from Visakhapatnam. They were from actually Andhra Pradesh, from Vijayawada and surrounding areas. And similarly for Rajkot, we actually had surveyors, students who actually did the survey. So studying in Rajkot.
Yeah, excellent. Because I just feel that, when we put out our research on the global field, it's extremely important to highlight that these surveys need a contextual and a local grounding. They cannot be a helicopter survey. They
No.
cannot be done, with the help of just numbers. And how that is a very, so you should probably highlight, and that should become a thing, that it's very, very important to remain rooted in the user, the
Yeah.
local
So
user.
so basically, to avoid that biasness. So as a as a someone resident of Kolkata, or I mean, I have lived in Ahmedabad, but my perspective also would vary.
Yes,
So that's the reason we
yes.
actually selected service. We almost took about like a week or two to train our surveyors.
Yes. No, it's very interesting that you spread it out over a wide sort of geographical strain. And it would be really interesting to see how, if any, there are any mild, cultural variations in
Yeah.
how people perceive these things. It would be there. Thank you so much. It was amazing. Made my morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. May I invite Professor Vasavra to perhaps lend his thoughts if he's able to, if his mic is not giving him too much trouble, Professor?
No. I don't have trouble.
Okay.
Only in the beginning
Okay. Great.
because I forgot to charge it.
I okay.
So no. Thank you very much, Tiyali.
Thank you, sir.
Uh, since this was your PhD, I'm sure it has a great value. And since you were at the CEPT and in Ahmedabad, I'm going to ask you some different types of questions.
Okay.
What is your impression about the VRTS in Ahmedabad?
So I'll talk about. I am someone who is very pro public transport. Okay, and me, it it is important to give space to public transport, because I'm a believer that your city is not developed if people travel in cars. If the higher income travel in buses, that is what. But if I'll I'll talk about the BRT planning. So if you look at the way the entire phasing of the BRT was taking place in uh, the Ahmedabad Janmarg, the way it took place in Ahmedabad, you will see that the first phase of the BRTS corridor was actually designed uh, along the first phase of the corridor was, there was already space allotted for the BRT. So I can't recall the name of the road right now, the ring road. So there was already space allocated. The roads were wide, and
It was 132 feet ring road.
yes, it was the 132 feet ring road. And when they placed the BRT along this corridor, the reason was because prior to that there was the Delhi BRT, which was a failure in that sense. But I think I'm not going to why it was another, but for Ahmedabad Janmarg, what they did was they specifically wanted to avoid that. I mean, I knew they specifically wanted to avoid that, and so it was planned along a corridor which was, you would know that you would get transit ridership. And public transport over a period of, so when you get the attention, when you get the ridership, and that is when you try to expand to the other areas where you will actually not make profit, and you might actually, that is when they moved into the troubled waters. Also, the other thing was, if you look at the DPR that was developed and when the plan was implemented, you can't make a public transport make it happen if you don't have, it has to be both push and pull factors. So you're giving a public transport, but even then, but along with that, you're encouraging parking on the road, you're giving free parking. So I mean, you have to balance out somewhere. You have to pull back somewhere, and if you want people to move into transport, you have to pull back somewhere. So, for me, what I felt was Janmarg, they had a good idea. In the DPR stage also, there were good policies and things like that, but when it came to implementation, it was not properly implemented as service. And that kind of, over a period.
What must be the reason for this? Because I'm just trying to know from you, because you have devoted your time and efforts to study, this kind of systems. I have observed this ever since it's really started happening, because your professor was a colleague of mine, and we used to sort of very keenly observe the entire process of this BRTS coming up in Ahmedabad, the question is, who all were involved in designing and planning, the BRTS was a very important thing. And I think that is where, what I would say is that it happened then in Rajkot. They tried in other cities, but everywhere, I think the initial processes were never questioned. And that is why even today, you might not know, but in 70s and late 60s, Ahmedabad had one of the best municipal transport services in the country.
Okay.
And that was really a wonderful service, which we have used in those days.
Okay.
But it was methodically, destroyed.
Dismantled. I think it was also something,
And now, what is happening is that this BRTS has even created problems for traffic in the city, which are terrible.
Yeah,
And it has also cut across the old city on the periphery, which also is terrible. So I think, in a sense, without really worrying about the planning and the processes, based on the demands, and its proper functioning, the Janamarg is there, yes, but after all, what is the agenda of Janamarg, So I think there are these issues, which are not really right now your forte, but I think they are really extremely important issues, because people don't use it.
Yes, and over a period of time, the ridership has actually fallen.
Absolutely.
Is decreasing.
And then this entire street, which is carved out from the main streets, is completely redundant. And it has really added to the traffic problems of the city. And now
they're planning a metro.
No, that is, yes, all that is, something, where our professionals are also part of it, Nobody has a gut to say that, no, you don't need this. Yes. So I think that is something, which I wanted to also add to this, because I think some kind of view on this, apart from what you do as your own preferred topic, would actually complete your study, as some kind of an introduction, to what is BRT. I will also tell you, I had a kind of good fortune to go to Curitiba in 2009-10. And I had a wonderful opportunity to visit Jaime Lerner's office.
Okay.
And, Jaime Lerner was very keenly interested in India. And Charles Correa invited him to Goa.
Okay.
And he came. And, I had a kind of wishful thinking that if he could divert his visit and see Ahmedabad and look at the BRT, he politely refused, and he says that it's a mistake to supplant a BRT on a historic city.
Okay.
And this is what we are doing everywhere. And Jaime Lerner is the originator of BRT.
Yes.
And if you have seen Curitiba, if you have experienced this there, then you would certainly feel that all this is complete waste of money in our country. You know, there are at least 7 different types of BRT systems in Curitiba.
Yes, they have bi-articulated, they have express
Absolutely.
services.
And you
Yes,
see,
yeah.
to add to the problem, what Ahmedabad has done is that on the BRT route, on 100 meter of either side of the route, they have now raised the floor space index to 5.4.
Yes, yes.
Which means they want to densify this, and that has really started a huge transformation of the city.
Yes.
You know, and you know,
I think
the
it was
purpose is,
BRT as well as the riverfront, both put together.
yeah, but riverfront is a different kind of a baby, you know. We don't really mix it, because if we mix all these, then we have terrible problems. You know, so we go one by one.
Yeah.
But you know, this kind of extensive densification along the BRTS route is something which they imagine is going to help sustain the BRT.
Yes,
But
yes.
which I think is a far cry. So I just wanted to, you know, bring you to this kind of issues, you know, related to BRT. But your model and your surveys and your, you know, attributes and other things are wonderful for your own study. But a little bit of prelude and little bit of, you know, a sort of summary of what happens with this whole BRT would have been really very good.
Okay, yes, sir. So basically, sir, also, in my thesis, I kind of discussed each and every bus systems in details. But over here, I just just
Of
picked
course,
up
I can see that.
bits and pieces of it.
Yeah, but this whole issue
Yes,
has
yes,
to
yes,
be
sir.
really, and you see, it's only in academic that you can do this. Shivanand can never do this.
Yeah,
You
he
see,
does.
because he's part of the system.
Yes, yes,
So
yes.
even if he knows, he can't put out. You
Yeah,
see, because
and yeah, it makes sense. Like if you look at the Bogota services also, like they carry, thousands of people daily.
yes,
While
and there are so many other issues. You see, like ticketing. You know.
yes, they have a proper integrated.
Yes.
The reason I actually fell in love with transportation is because so I had visited Germany when I was in around 2011, and I was new to the city. I was new to the country. I did not understand German. I went to Hamburg for about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I think so. And all I had was I knew Guten Morgen, Danke, Guten Tag, and I knew the names of. I had written down the names of the places that I would visit, and I had a map, and I was alone in the city, and I travel. I extensively use public transport. I had so they have a single ticketing system where you could use the ticket for trains, metros, trams, buses, ferry, and it was just one ticket. Delhi Metro only has fare integration for its various routes and its RRTS service with in Gurgaon, but they actually had a proper fare integration across various public transport modes. And not only that, it was such a seamless, anywhere you go, where you are, what is the nearest, what are the alternative transport you have over there, when will the next bus come, in how many minutes, so they have entire transit information over there. There was an entire maps and routing systems. Where is your taxi service? What are the nearest landmarks? And I never felt that I was new to a country.
No, but if you simply, I mean, this is true with any other country. I must tell you, and it is extremely highly, sort of coordinated in Japan.
Yes.
If you are in Japan, I think it is minute to minute.
Okay. Yes.
And even at the smallest bus stop, you see, there is everything available to you. Even if it is a pole, as a bus stop, the pole has all the information. So I think everywhere, but we don't learn from this. You see, I think we simply do this and then forget it. Thank you so much, Tiyali. Thank you.
Thank
you. Himanshu, I think you have a follow-up or a comment.
Yeah. Thanks, Radha. It's pertaining to what Professor Vasauda just mentioned. in terms of you know uh, the different systems of transport, specifically public transport and bus. So Delhi, Bombay used to have. Now I don't see double-decker buses anymore in Bombay, and only in certain routes. Delhi, once upon a time, had double-decker buses way back, I think 40 or 50 years ago, and that got eradicated or that got moved out, and now we are all using single-decker buses. Uh, I've seen bi-articulated buses in Bombay, and that really worked well. So the addition of these components, bi-articulated buses or double-decker buses, or even for that matter, open buses, really, changes the overall experience. And experience is one of your factor that you are taking into consideration.
I have a
If I can,
reservation.
if I can complete, if I can complete.
Sure, sure, sure.
So these additions of systems into the larger picture of bus system really changes the experience and perhaps pushes it. At least when I was growing up in Bombay, I never thought there were these two models. One is single decker, one is double decker. And going from home to school, I always preferred double decker because I would get the front seat right at the at the top of the top level, and my bus would go from Marine Drive area. So from front window, I could see the Queen's Necklace completely, and that kind of changed my understanding of going to school because I loved that and I loved that journey. I loved that moment of sitting in double decker and enjoying the Queen's Necklace. Although the distance was just about 4 kilometers, and I can easily 4 or 3 kilometers I can easily walk or cycle. But that journey, giving 50 paise, it doesn't matter to me. I just went and took that journey because I could see Queen's Necklace, and that was one of the attribute which told me that I must use public transport. And I could see people using that idea in Delhi also for that matter, because these are the two cities where I have closely lived and experienced, other than Chennai and Ahmedabad. But so do you think that if these components are reintroduced in the city, you think the usage of public transport will increase because you're giving a new experience, including open deck?
Yes. So giving there's a challenge in double decker buses. The thing is, I think I'm not an expert, but what I have learned is I'm all like, even Kolkata had double decker buses, and as a kid I remember you know getting onto
Yes.
double decker, and the same experience which you were saying. I mean, yes, Kolkata did not, but that ride from Howrah Bridge, and it's mesmerizing, it's beautiful. Yes, the only challenge with double decker buses is, what this is not, I'm very sure of, but this was something that I had read somewhere. Uh, the the overall speed of the bus gets affected. Okay, there is something like that. I'm not an expert in this, so I can't give. This is something that I had read, but yes, I mean, and I think some cities, like I think Kolkata is trying to reintroduce these kind of open bus services and double decker bus services as luxury. You have these tourist trips, so that is one thing. But with bi-articulated buses or tri-articulated buses, the challenge is because these buses require a larger radii at turning points. So it's not always that every city has wider routes. So the turning curvature, that would matter. So say your Bangalore actually has some bi-articulated buses. So I mean,
True,
I don't
but
know. I'm not sure about I mean, double-decker buses and open buses, yes, but with bi-articulated buses, like for the simple example that the current JNNURM buses that were introduced, they were larger than the previous buses, and we actually conversed with drivers, and what they would say is they would actually, and I'm talking very specifically in context to Kolkata, Visakhapatnam, and Rajkot. What they would say is that in cities. It's not always that you actually have such wide roads, and so turning the curvature would actually hamper, it would take a lot of time, and even though there are trained drivers, it actually sometimes turning buses would lead to rather congestion. So I'm not so much for bi-articulated buses. Yes, if you have a dedicated corridor and things like that, like a BRT, bi-articulated buses make sense. But again, sing I mean, otherwise the single buses makes more sense. But yeah, for open buses and double-decker buses, we still may explore it.
Okay, because true and bi-articulated buses would require a greater radii, but only on
Yeah.
dedicated routes it can work. But if people start seeing these kind of components or elements on road, that curiosity, picks up, and then from there they might change and they may want to experiment with the system once again. So maybe so I'm just thinking out loud whether these
Yeah.
kind of components elements would really help the public to ponder upon usage of public transport at great scale. And thanks to you.
The bi-articulated buses are there even in small towns in Germany.
Yeah.
And Curitiba, the historic town, has bi-articulated buses. So I think it's not the question of the size of the street or the length of the street.
Okay.
In fact, bi-articulated buses on straight routes would be useless. You see, because I think when you have this kind of, twists and turns in the historic cities of country, I think you get this, you see, because it is a tremendous facility for the passengers. Because you can enter any, so I think it is something, which needs to be seen. Also, you must see, I think I'm sure you have studied Curitiba, but
Yes.
look at the way the entire system is planned, including the bus stops.
Yes. Yes.
And look at in Ahmedabad, each bus stop was costing hell of a lot of money. It is a absolute, criminal wastage of money. Glass bus stops in the city like Ahmedabad, which is absolutely hot. Even now, you can't stand outside. So I think, the entire purpose of this kind of facility is many times completely diverted, for different types of purposes, So I think it has to be a total thing, I think, and that is something, which is missing. Even in Rajkot, I know that town very well. And one of my students was working on the BRT bus stations and things like that. And I used to always joke with him. I said, what the hell are you doing? So I think, you see, because what happens in Ahmedabad becomes a kind of prototype for other towns in Gujarat, So I think it is all something, where I think in your kind of a study, a preamble to talk about these issues and something, which can lead to better, provisions at the end with body of your work could really be very meaningful.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you, Professor. Vibhuti, may I invite you now for a comment?
It was no thanks, Radha. I think we've running out of time, but also thank you, Tiyali, for presenting this to us. Not only there was a sense of great rigor in your methodology, which is a characteristic of this forum, and whenever that happens, of course, yours is a polished work, and sometimes you present ideas in progress, so we're not able to attain that. But to see for especially people working in architecture and design, the methodology that involves graphs and rises and dips and that kind of evidence is very, very important. I think architects and designers also need to kind of work with some sort of an evidence-based methodology where they're able to demonstrate, the solutions that they give for other people. I mean, that's just nature of our discipline. But thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about your future projects, and I wanted to ask you whether, the 3 towns you worked on have histories, have a sense of, their perception is shaped by their histories as well. And how much of that kind of surfaced when you were doing the survey, and whether that influenced your database as well, that we can't be talking to such people, or we can't be talking. So any database will have those, as you say, biases, but I think those are discussions for And I'm sure, the rigor that your work reflects is a testimony itself that, you have very consciously dealt with most biases. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vibhuti. Okay, you have Piyush has thanked you for your presentation and Himanshu seconds. If you could very, very quickly, Tiyali, sorry, because we've totally run out of time. She's asked a question: have you looked at incentives by the authority to encourage public transportation use? This is a question from Ekta. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, we did. I mean, we were exploring subsidies and, how. So, we were actually incentives. Yes, sometimes incentives. What we found, like, incentives was actually we were looking into when we were looking into the literature of the world. But, over a period of time, we also found that, incentives initially helps you to bring into the service, like, same with Ahmedabad, Janmarg or whatever. So they had so the best incentive is a price incentive, and a very low price or some kind of free passes. It helps you to initially bring people, but over a period of time it may not sustain. So instead of I felt, so this is my opinion, so instead of giving incentives, it is better to provide a good service where you don't need incentives and people will automatically come. You would rather develop a solid system than give incentives to bring people. People will always come if you have a good service. If you're able to sustain a good service, you will be able to retain your ridership. But incentives helps in to bring that initial, it's like bringing the initial moolah, but over a period of time it doesn't work.
Right. Avitesh, sorry, we are really running out of time, but very quickly, if you're raising your hand. Avitesh, is it? Or is it Nina? No. Okay, I think it's Nina. Sorry, I think I've already taken that. Sorry. So thank you so much, Tiyali. I think with that, we'll call it a day. I know some people had to leave already because of, classes starting at 10. And we must go. So we will be coming to, winding down this semester of proposition 2 weeks from now. That's going to be our final proposition. And then, of course, we'll return in August, hopefully in better times. But thank you all for coming. And thank you, Tiyali, for wonderful presentation.
Thank you for all your comments. It was really helpful. Thank you. It felt good to talk about transport.
Right. All right. Thank you, everyone.